our season continues in the middle of the night, with fire exploding across the skies. Mandalore's capital, Sundari, was undergoing another round of bombardments. Master Plo, who slept with the troops in the trenches, turned to his men and asked for a status report. One of the captains running down the earthworks gave him an update. The Sith were planting their heavy tanks on the surface and blasting at the shields again. Though it should be said, some of the shots were going over it. Plo pushed against his knees and stood up, asking about the rear flank. The clone reported that there were available troopers in every quadrant. If the Sith really wanted to make an entrance, they'd know about it. That, after all, was the benefit of defending a location like Mandalore, and especially Sundari. The dome sat in the middle of a flat plain, so there was no natural cover for anyone. The Sith fleet sat just outside of firing range of the Star Destroyers, and no one could sneak around the Republic defense line and break in, not even a singular Sith. Plo thanked the trooper and stretched his shoulders. His new metallic arm tingled with every movement. Plo was getting used to it, but he still needed some time. He climbed out of the trench and walked towards the command post, situated behind 3 layers of trenches, heavy cannons, a few tanks, and gunships too. When he arrived, he found some Mandalorian leaders serving with the Duchess, including some still awake troopers. He listened to them, but most of it wasn't retained information. They were struggling to get communication off-world. The distress beacon had been activated, but they didn't know if anyone had heard it or seen it. Plo sighed. He knew what this meant for him. He was 1 Jedi against 3 Sith Lords. They wouldn't back down from Mandalore either. They were here to capture the world completely, or destroy the capital and leave its citizens without leadership. Plo crossed his arms and turned back to look across the plains, now only lit with red and orange hues. Blaster fire poured out of enemy cannons. He knew what fate faced him. His time would come. Whether or not he survived the duel with the Sith, he did not know, but Plo was more than aware that the Sith would figure this out. If he was the only Jedi, then they could overpower him as a trio, and nothing would stop them. Not the elite troopers of the 104th, nor the Mandalorians who repelled Darzana before. Their best chance at survival was in hoping that the disruption of supply lines would redirect a fleet towards their location. However, Kreia had prepared for that by adding Darth Nihilus and Sion to their siege. They were situated in a separate attack fleet, just outside the atmosphere of the system. They arrived shortly after the recent defeat on the surface. Kreia wanted her students present. Finally, Sion could potentially redeem himself. The 2 other members of the Sith Triumvirate paced across the bridge of the ship, checking scanners every other hour, and finding absolutely nothing of any value. No one was coming. Elsewhere, as Kreia had predicted, the Jedi and Republic High Command came to the conclusion that Mandalore was being attacked again. With pushes being made towards Mon Calamari and the recent, now known about success in the freeing of the Axis of 3, the Republic recognized the stagnation in effective trade. Mandalore was the base of supply redistribution in the upper east quadrant of the galaxy. Without it, they would need to dive in the hot space, which was already problematic. The Republic was already stretched out. The new location for the Starforge had supply vessels going further west into the galaxy, making an already vulnerable asset almost entirely defenseless. The Forge was surviving, but if the Sith caught on to the route, then it would be captured and/or destroyed. While the Republic had done a fine job at mobilizing, thanks in part to the Starforge, they still struggled with making ends meet in the supply realm. That of course led back to the main problem that faced the Republic, the Void. If the Outer Rim thugs continued hitting operational bases for redistribution and goods, then the Republic would likely lose this war. There were militias, but due to early war news reports regarding the destruction that faced several star systems that rebelled against the Sith Empire, people were apprehensive about joining any militia. These smaller skirmishes were putting the Republic into tough positions, because clones and Jedi generals couldn't be pulled back from their positions. Admiral Coburn's and General Tin's assignments north of Mandalore were providing a perfect avenue for General Billaba to make a push for Mon Calamari. If the Republic could activate another drive yards or shipyards, especially after the destruction of everything on Corellia and Kuat, then they could stay ahead where it counted. High Command heard nothing about any plans from the Sith to continue their Resurgence shipbuilding project, so they mostly assumed the massive vessels were gone, but they still had to be cautious. The Republic was quickly adapting its strategy, but morale was really low. Following Tarkin's betrayal in the battle at System 9Z1, they weren't really sure how to hold off a three-sided conflict. They were fighting the Separatists infrequently, the Sith most of the time, and their citizens were attempting to keep a grip on their food and supplies. It was a terrible, terrible time, and the Jedi weren't much help either. They no longer had a collective manpower or really any trust to split their forces up to strategic locations across the edge of the Outer Rim. There were Jedi out there, but not as many as there were before. But there might be a fix for all of that. A chance, if you will. Just south of Callist, on the crossroads of the Rima trade route and Corellian trade spire, over the Metis system, a Republic shuttle exited from hyperspace. Anakin paced around the cockpit, telling them all that if they were approached by a larger ship and/or captured, he was giving them direct orders to escape this planet without him. This almost gave Ahsoka a literal panic attack. She couldn't handle losing anyone else, let alone her own master. But he reminded them all, in an almost cocky way, that he'd find a way out of it if it came to it. They had been told by General Kalani of the Confederacy that Admiral Trench had interest in forming an alliance. The Republic shuttle floated aimlessly over Metis, as Anakin ran through a couple preventative contingencies to protect their interests over the system, in the case of a Separatist attack, while their fears would be ignited the moment a CIS battleship exited from hyperspace, a singular vessel with wide markings across the ship's bow. They all looked to each other, and Burst got cold feet immediately. His usually calm demeanor dropped and he gripped the control yokes, preparing to pull backwards, but stopping because Zan rested his hand on his shoulder. The communication device beeped and Anakin pressed it. Admiral Trench shot to life with a blue, blurry haze. He informed the Jedi that they were invited to join him inside of the ship. He also apologized because he knew that his flagship was quite imposing, but they couldn't be too safe, not with the Sith lurking. The call ended, and Zan piloted the shuttle forward. Everyone braced themselves, but Anakin stepped out of the cockpit, readying himself. Obi-Wan had always been the negotiator during his Padawan years. It was his first real-time negotiating by himself. This would be a very challenging experience because he was serving on behalf of the Republic, the entire Republic. Padme, though, would have been proud, and so would Natabre and Obi-Wan. Hopefully, as long as he didn't mess up. Skywalker pushed those negative thoughts from his head as the ramp ahead of him lowered to the ground. Ahsoka had considered asking him if he was alright, but she understood that this would be challenging. When the ramp landed on the hangar bay, an escort of Magna Guards accompanied Admiral Trench. Skywalker walked down and greeted him. The clone commandos and Ahsoka stood inside the vessel. Trench invited them. He had fresh food and drink if they'd like. The clones looked to each other, afraid to lower their guard, and Trench stepped past Anakin. He understood how difficult it would be to find peace, but if he wanted them dead, any of them, he could have just taken out their shuttle. He had plenty of chances to. There were far greater concerns in the galaxy than a shuttle containing 6 Republic, heroes, I guess? Trench tapped his cane against the ground and the Magna Guards dispersed. Anakin walked beside the Admiral and they started talking. First were the pleasantries. Trench knew a lot about Anakin and spoke highly of his successes across the Eastern Quadrant, and also Trench stopped and looked to everyone else in their party. He told them all they did extremely well against the Sith in the Deep Core. He asked if the drive yards were destroyed in the process of their evacuation. Anakin stopped in his tracks and looked at Trench with a confused expression. He patted Skywalker's shoulder and told him reassuringly that the Sith had been knocking on their doors for months. Did they think he wouldn't notice the massive rhydonium explosion over Biss? To be fair, Anakin should have expected that answer, because the Rhydo detonation was a very big affair. They had seen the remnants of the fleet when they passed through. Anakin, in an effort to return said kindness to Trench, congratulated him on his known battles won against the Sith. He tried to avoid the whole 3-way counter on Zaheth. Anakin couldn't remember if it was Zaheth or Pax, but He didn't want to bring up an actual battle between the CIS and Republic. This was for an alliance. At the end of Anakin's own praise, they entered a boardroom where General Kalani stood, looking out the viewport. The clones and Jedi were given their seats, and food was brought along for them. It was freshly cooked, and a dish that Trench quite enjoyed. Everyone started eating, as at the end of the table, Trench and Anakin started their actual discussions. The Admiral broke everything down from his perspective. The Separatists had a benefit to being on the inside of the galactic map. They were protected in some shape or form from the Republic. He admitted that they had figured out that High Command had no interest in fighting off the Confederacy. So even though CIS fleets were protecting their southern perimeter, neighboring Republic territory, their focus remained solely on the Sith. Trench, though, admitted frustratedly that the recent attacks and raids led by the Void changed all of that. Initially, the super tactical droids believed it was a Republic decoy, but none of their fleet movements aligned with the raids. They were also too small and fractured to be related to Republic personnel. Trench used this as a backhand way to complement the Republic's professionalism in the field of war. His tusks clicked, and he scoffed down a large bite of food, as Anakin mimicked to a much smaller degree. General Kalani, in this bite, spoke over Trench and suggested that the Void was causing a ruckus for everyone. At least they thought so, until CIS commando droids reported on dealings in Sith territory. There hadn't been any known about direct interactions between the Void or the Sith Empire, but Trench assumed a smaller vessel moved into the Outer Rim to broker a deal. Kalani expressed that, by his calculations, the Republic had likely come to the conclusion that the Void and the Sith Empire were working together. Being that the Confederacy realized this too, they were openly proposing an alliance. The feud that separated the Republic and Confederacy really didn't exist anymore. Without the Senate or the government, the Republic was led by officers and Jedi, so what purpose would either have to stand against the other? Trench started speaking again, informing Anakin that he understood Republic High Command might be a little less sympathetic to the Confederacy, but this war was not winnable without one another. Trench knew that the CIS could effectively combat the Void and the Sith more effectively if transparency between territory was permitted. Trench wanted for both factions to allow each other into their territory so that they could move into either the Outer Rim or the core. The Sith could start slipping behind, and if they in an alliance seized the moment, they could win the war. Trench and Kalani, including several other CIS super tactical droids, presumed that the alliance between the Void and the Sith Empire was started due to desperation. If the Sith were growing desperate, then the crucial loss at Biss could be a sign of the changing tides. This was their chance for victory, to reclaim a galaxy that was their own. Anakin asked, if they signed the treaty, what would happen after the war? Would they return to enemies, or would the political differences that separated them return to the forefront of the galaxy? Trench correctly assumed that Anakin was too young to watch the Republic dismantle its alliances in the galaxy, but he didn't believe that it would happen again. The Confederacy had a government, its survivors still lived within their coalition, but they were not leading it. Everything went through Admiral Trench. He was their singular leader, with, of course, the Council of Tactical Droids working behind him. He admitted that he didn't want anyone to feel pressured, and he knew that by delivering home-cooked food might be considered bribery, but they couldn't maintain this war with the Sith Empire and the Void without each other. Eventually, one of them would buckle. If the CIS lost to the Sith, then all of that territory between the Republic and the Empire would become a staging ground for more war. The Republic would effectively be surrounded by the Syndicates and the Sith, and they would not survive that. The same went for the Confederacy, which Kalani calculated following the recent events at Coruscant. Anakin watched the super tactical droid and then turned to Trench. How did they know about the destruction of the superstructure over the former Republic capital? It made Anakin a little uneasy, but he asked if he might be able to make his own counters to the suggested treaty, and Trench told him by all means. Skywalker knew that diplomacy wasn't his strong suit, but just allowing a fully transparent, no-borders alliance would be foolish. He assumed that Trench wanted to take advantage of his inexperience and make the Republic pay for it. If Skywalker didn't challenge this stance, then it might make the Republic look weaker than it really was by refusing this alliance. Anakin in this moment told Trench that an avenue would be more effective for everyone. It would provide the Confederacy with a route to the Outer Rim without intervening in Republic supply lines or movement routes. The Admiral nodded his head and rubbed his tusks, listening. Anakin knew that Republic High Command would go for a treaty because, honestly, and he opened admittedly, that he probably shouldn't be telling him this, but they were having a rough time with the syndicates. They were constantly up in their faces. Skywalker believed that it'd be more efficient to pour a singular, united military force through one avenue into the Outer Rim. It would completely catch the Void off guard, and it wouldn't allow them to request reinforcements if they did it properly together. Trench turned to Kalani, who calculated in a split moment that this would be the most effective approach to strategy in the Outer Rim. Trench looked a little unhappy about it, but didn't verbally say anything against it. The Admiral agreed with his super tactical droid, and asked what the Republic would be willing to agree on inside the Outer Rim. Anakin was a little unsure of what this meant, but he BS'd his way into an answer. He told Trench that splitting the territory would be effective. Perhaps on the avenue where the CIS could enter, maybe they could have that half of the Outer Rim, while the other east quadrant near Hutt Space and Obadiah would go to the Republic. It both made sense in the context of the meeting and in what Anakin knew about Republic strategy. If they had help taking Hutt territory, the Republic could go around Sith strongholds in the East Quadrant and get to Mon Calamari easier. Trench was obviously withholding his information, but this was Anakin's main focus, protecting Hutt space for Republic interests and ensuring that the Republic didn't get the short end of the stick. The CIS did have some leverage here, because their territory was right next to the Sith Empire in the core and Inner Rim, but this was a solid start. Kalani, who had been writing on a holopad, finalized some pieces of the document. Anakin asked a few more questions, some minor changes were made, and the initial treaty was created. It started with a ceasefire. Anakin and Trench, from this system, would request all troops to refuse combat with the opposing faction. Skywalker had to return all this information to Republic High Command and the Jedi Council. Trench would wait for their responses eagerly. Following their meal, they would leave. The clones and Ahsoka both congratulated Anakin to holding his own. Trench was very clearly trying to get as much leverage as possible, but Skywalker didn't let up, though Anakin could only ever praise Obi-Wan for having taught him all those methods. Without Kenobi's training, it would have looked a lot worse for the Republic. Over Coruscant, inside the Emperor's flagship, Zala swung her lightsaber aggressively at the Dark Honor Guard across from her. Their sabers clashed and bursted with light. She spun around as the guard's crimson saber was driven at her abdomen. She narrowly avoided, kicking her legs over and sweeping them out from under the warrior. Zala shoved her weapon downwards and let it sizzle against the skin of the guard, before turning to her instructor. Valkorin stood silently, with his arms tied behind his back. He nodded, and the two other honor guards ignited their stabs and charged in. Zala turned around and raised her still blue saber and defended a strike, but falling backwards. She rolled across the ground and pressed her hand into its rough surface. The guards moved outwardly to flank her, and she pressed her hand into the ground and leapt between them. She swung to the left and then to the right, forcing herself to dig deeper into the dark side. Every flash was a memory, blurred by the hue that surrounded her. She only now envisioned her master's death on Coruscant, and it drove her. The Tabre was set up to fail by the corrupt Jedi Council. She slashed downwards, slicing the staff in half and kicked forward, ducking another counter and feeling the heat raise the top of her back. That pain fueled her. The dark side was her ally. Zala gripped her weapon harder and swung it around her shoulder, colliding and clashing. They traded blows, and the honor guard got the upper hand, swinging her arm around her back and pinning her to the ground. Their staff dipped into the training arena and slowly dragged towards her face. This would result in defeat, but she, from this perspective, caught a glimpse of her master. His face remained emotionless, and his posture unchanged. She shoved her palm against the surface with all of her pain, sending little shocks across her back, shoulder, and pinned arm. She launched herself off the ground with a burst of energy. The guard flipped on their back, and she rolled around on the ground and batted her saber across her body. The guard blocked the strike and fell over her. Zala shot her hand outwards again, fueled by this time the betrayal of the Jedi and the destruction of Akhtum. She imagined the fires and felt them in her heart. The guard flew through the air and crashed into the wall, but Zala held the guard in position and slowly rose to her feet, shoving harder as cracks formed around the individual's body. Screams of pain were released, and she turned her head towards her master, who nodded. The guard fell and slammed into the ground. Valkorin told Zala that she still had much to learn if she ever expects to lead warriors into battle. She then shot back, telling him that she knew she wasn't ready, but the Republic needed to pay. Valkorin nodded in agreement. They did. They really did. Until then, he had a gift for her, something he planned on giving her per her first completed trial. While Zala had been training with the Honor Guard since Valkorin deemed her ready, this was her first victory. She impressed him. Her training was progressing and her use of the dark side was growing. This holocron would help submerge her into the dark side of the Force. She was still too imbalanced. Her growth was adequate, but Valkorin knew a truth that he did not intend on sharing with her, until he trusted in what she could be. This was an odd situation for Valkorin, but he knew he could play it favorably for himself. Typically, the Sith Emperor wouldn't be so kind to an individual struggling with the dark side. Zala wasn't a special case because of favoritism. It was because she applied the correct amount of pressure on things that actively irritated Valkorin. For instance, the most obvious example, his belligerent children were finally getting the message that they could be replaced. Vaylin was already making moves, likely to protect herself in the wake of her brother's failure at System 9Z1. Valkorin could be very unforgiving. Vaylin took Bastilla's words to heart and planned on acting on them. She was currently attempting to investigate the former Axis of Three. She would very soon come back with disappointing results. Her brothers, Arkan and Thexan, were in an entirely different boat. The Jedi had been able to outmaneuver them, and sure, they had found victory at different points in the war, but they were still far from successful. The Sith Order, or as Lord Ragnos called it, the Sith Congress, was getting impatient with the brothers' lack of success. Their recent beatdown from Malgus had them both in recovery, waiting for their chance to try and prove their father's frustrations wrong. They wanted to make things right, but Valkorin was again utilizing Zala to firm his grip. She was the perfect storm, a Jedi on the run, someone who gave him the intel on the Starforge, someone who could turn his children into formidable foes, and someone that he could use against the Jedi that so frustratingly survived the betrayal at Akhtum. The Emperor had no intention of informing Zala about the Jedi's survival until the right moment, and while he would humor the idea of actually legitimately taking her on as an apprentice, the Sith Lord only planned to use her presence to intimidate those he expected more from. However, depending on how effective that strategy was, she might have more time to earn his full favorability. He was already displeased with the recent event at Biss, and at the very least, Zala provided something positive. The growth was visible, and that was more than anything else the Sith Empire had at this moment in his eyes. Mirroring his disappointment over Biss was a mounting struggle in two different locations on the Eastern Front. Freya was launching yet another attack, while out further east, Master Billaba was leading troops into Floren. The system was just south of Korriban, northwest of Mon Calamari, and a little northeast of Raxus. She and her troops didn't have to face a heavy resistance in space, due to the hellscape created on the surface of the planet. An ancient Sith Lord walked the scorched world. His Sith magic had torn the population apart, and left most of the sentient life on the planet in a zombified state. So why would Deppa find herself and her troopers on the surface? To destroy the Sith, of course. They couldn't make a full push towards Mon Calamari without fully knocking out any and every Sith in their way. The Republic fleet hovered in the atmosphere as Deppa's admiral started putting together pieces for their assault at Mon Calamari. Instead of building an assault towards the former shipbuilding world, the Sith placed one of their lords at the underwater paradise. Whether or not the Sith had eviscerated the people beneath the seas remained relatively unknown to the Republic. Deppa, though, had to focus on one battle at a time, as Master Windu had instructed her during her Padawan years. Instead of traveling with her own student, Caleb Dume was safely on Tir Nanog with Sola Grey and the others. He'd received formal training from a collection of Jedi rather than Deppa, who was needed out here. Gunships sped through the atmosphere of the torn-apart planet of Floren. The Sith on the surface turned their cannons towards the skies and fired away. More than anything, the base on Floren acted more like an alchemic, ritualistic homeworld for the Sith. There were many individuals who conspired with Lord Valkorn, and this individual was no different. The system had an abundance of resources to test new powers on. Lord Naja Sado stepped out of his hut and scanned the skies. Republic LAATs buzzed through the flag. Deppa gripped the handlebars inside of the hero protagonist gunship as nearby vessels were blown out of the sky. She told the troops to hold on as the doors opened and clones loaded their weapons over the edge. The LAATs drifted around to the side so that clones could unload their blasters into the unsuspecting Sith troopers. Their cannons and tanks fired into the skies, but the gunships remained evasive. Not for nothing, but this base was most importantly designed to repel bombardments from large cruisers, not LAATs. The cannons could knock out a couple of gunships, but not all of them. Deppa ignited her lightsaber and leapt out of her gunship under the protection of clone blaster fire. She landed on the ground with a thud, dispersing smoke and ash into the air. Clones behind her landed and exited from their transports as they took to the skies again to provide cover fire. She wheeled her weapon around in her hand and charged the base. They didn't have any walls, it was simply an open outpost, designed specifically for Lord Sado's alchemic works. He ignited his heavy saber and directed troops to create makeshift ramparts, but the clones were already closing in. Their blue bolts cascaded over the lifeless surface, clipping and doming Sith troopers. They were unprepared, and it showed immediately. Without protection and decent ground to run across, the Sith had a chance to recover themselves, but Deppa's aggressive assault had artillery pieces exploding under the fire of the LAATs. She deflected bolts back into the Sith lines, forcing a number of them to almost drop instantly. Behind her, the clones continued pushing until her opponent drew himself from the protection of the camp and lunged across the field at her. Their weapons interlocked in the middle of the plains. Clones rushed past them as their sabers collided. Deppa used Form 3 to defend herself from Sado's large and winding strikes. The weight of the saber's hilt and his focus on alchemic studies left him swinging wildly. She rolled around him using her light frame to avoid his attacks. He fired electricity at the Jedi Master and she blocked it, seizing the moment to sweep the force under his legs, but she didn't attack, giving him a chance to rise again. Sado attempted to torment the Jedi, or at least make her act. She refused, despite her desire to end him as quickly as possible. Lord Sado told her about the population and how they begged for mercy as he stripped this planet of life, one quadrant at a time. Their weapons interlocked, but she did not bite the bait. She defended herself, as he tried to draw off the suffering of the people for his own power. It gave him very little advantage, as Deppa switched into forms that she learned under Mace's tutelage. These aggressive strikes, mixed with her readiness to avoid him, left Sado overstriking and clashing uneasily. Billaba wasn't going to give the Sith a chance to surrender. He was just one piece to a wider puzzle, another individual that needed to die for inflicting pain on the innocent. Their sabers buzzed against each other, and he attempted to summon lightning from the heavens. He raised one hand over his head as he shoved his saber against hers. Deppa could see the clouds start to form, obstructing the view of her gunships. She shoved harder and pushed back with equal strength before she pulled her saber away and ducked. He naturally continued pushing and thus fell forward, allowing Deppa to swing her saber across his legs, dropping him to the stubs of his knees. She spun around him and shoved her saber through his back as he let out a painful howl. His life was pulled from his body in that instant, and the clouds above dispersed, allowing the clones to finish up the rest of their assault. Deppa's Commander Grey informed her immediately of their victory, and she thanked him, quickly getting into contact with the Admiral, who informed her that they had a straight shot from Mon Calamari. All that remained in their way was the blockade. Inside a fleet moving between systems, a Republic shuttle exited from hyperspace and landed on the flagship. Anakin, Ahsoka, and the Tython 4 quickly shuffled to the command deck, where officers and admirals gathered. This is Republic High Command. They were informed of General Skywalker's urgent message, so they eagerly waited for him to return with what he called the chance for peace. They all looked to him when he entered, surrounded by his crew. He quickly tapped onto the control console, and a hologram popped up, decrypting the treaty and everything it entailed. Officers from around the bridge looked at it, as individuals in various starships in close proximity to the flagship tuned in. There were murmurs and even a couple speculative comments that slipped into Anakin's ears, but he didn't mind any of it. His purpose was to deliver the message, explain the treaty in detail, and unite the two struggling powers. For 30 minutes, Skywalker would explain everything, and then answer some questions from the officers. There were legitimate concerns regarding the intentions of the Confederacy, but seeing that General Skywalker pushed for an avenue, rather than giving total access to Republic territory, they found it easy to trust this document. Anakin had some other proposals, including an avenue through Separatist territory, so that the Republic could begin besieging the core, due to their lack of foothold on the core. It's not like they any longer had Corellia, Biss, Callist, or Kuat to base their operations out of, so it made sense to be a natural addition to this treaty. After Anakin spoke, he told Ahsoka to go get some rest, and a clone would take her to an unused quarter in the vessel so she could sleep. The Tython 4 said their goodbyes. They had another mission, and were being dispatched for combat again. Omega Squad and Delta Squad were being tasked with missions across the mid-core to northern Inner Rim. The Republic needed to keep pressure on these zones. Anakin also learned from the same officer who dispatched the Tython 4 that a clone force from Kamino would be entering combat soon, one called Clone Force 99. She explained that this unit was created by Nala Se, something of a personal project, while they expanded their facilities on Bora Vio. Anakin appreciated the update, then tuned back into the discussions. It would be a terribly long day, but it came with more answers. There were some other Jedi who interacted with this, most notably Master Windu, but everyone else was either preoccupied or moving fleets like Master Billaba. The Republic knew they should take the deal, especially with the information from Toydaria acquired by Quinlan Voss. The Void Wookiee warrior Black Chrysanthemum revealed information about the forces gathering inside the Void. Without this information, the Republic would be less inclined to side with the Confederacy. What Quinlan learned was the reason the Void was so effective at striking the Republic was because of the incentive. Chrysanthemum didn't reveal everything, but he at least depicted a vision of what the Republic should expect. Every single citizen that called the Outer Rim home was recruited to fight with the Sith Empire, so anyone that they considered able-bodied ended up joining Void raids on the Separatists and the Republic. As far as they knew, the Confederacy didn't know about this, but this specific information would become shared if the treaty was agreed upon. Eventually, Anakin would need to step away from the command bridge. Despite the Republic government being destroyed by the Sith Empire, and its representatives, the survivors at least, scattered across the stars, the Republic military was filled with just as much bureaucracy as the old Senate. After leaving, Anakin would interact with an entirely different subsection of the Republic military structure. The strategists inside the Capital Fleet were discussing plans for the attack at Mandalore. While the distress beacon hadn't been received, the lack of contact from the system only meant one thing: invasion. High Command was trying to figure out a pathway to free Mandalore, but that was the problem. They didn't have free troops to send anywhere. They were struggling with long-range contact of forces in the north above Mandalore, and thanks to the attacks by the Void, clones and starfleets were stuck protecting supply lines rather than cutting off the Sith from Mandalore. However, and General Skywalker made this point, if the Mandalorians were in danger, and the Republic didn't have the forces, why not use the newly acquired fleet from the former Axis of 3? The fleet was huge, and if they redistributed some of their available forces, they might be able to protect Mandalore, at a slight risk of rupturing the supply line for a couple days, potentially weeks. Skywalker knew it wouldn't fly, but at least the option of redirecting Republic troops from the Axis to Mandalore was available. There were thousands of troops that had been stuck since the beginning of the war, just training, waiting for their opportunity. Some of them even had genuine battle experience that could be used on the front lines. On Tir na Nog, the home of the Jedi, Master Oppo Rancisis ended a communication from Anakin. He wasn't available for the recent developments that involved High Command. Even though the relationship with the Republic remained strained, the Jedi in active combat were trying their best to make things work. The galaxy hung in the balance, and their duty was to the galactic population, even if the Republic had seemingly betrayed them. Oppo had his own issues to deal with. The figure seen in the Force by Sola Grey was nothing more than an apparition, similar to the individual that Anakin saw prior to the healing he received. Bastila was hunting down the Jedi per her master's orders. She was tasked with a number of objectives because the Emperor trusted her. While wiping out the Jedi was seemingly as difficult as finding them, she did have a lead. Bastila had seen Sola before inside of Revan's flagship, but they had no formal connection. The Sith Lord, who roamed around the galaxy seemingly aimlessly, had constant points of interest. However, what eluded Sola was whether or not the vision was real. Bastila presented herself as if she were actually interacting with Sola, similar to Plagueis with Anakin, but the truth is, Sola could have just imagined all of it in her mind. Thanks to Oppo visiting the Force with her and scouting the area, he confirmed that no one was present on the planet, or at least no one that they could find. It did leave him concerned with Sola's well-being, but to Oppo's defense, a former Sith interacting with a Sith apparition wasn't a positive sign for their progress. However, the Jedi Council, prior to Anakin's involvement, had suggested giving Sola Grey more leniency. This didn't mean giving her a lightsaber, but allowing her to feel more welcome within their ranks. She was one of the oldest individuals on the planet. She was willingly contributing to their efforts. And by oldest, it's because she was like one of 5 individuals that wasn't a youngling or young Padawan. While Oppo instructed the students daily, he took it upon himself to take care of Sola Grey, following whatever this vision was. It would be wise for them to assume that this was the same parlor trick used originally on Skywalker, but he believed the Sith to be more creative than that. If anything recently reported from Floren told him anything, there were thousands of Sith across the galaxy attempting numerous alchemic forms of torture. Using the same thing that Anakin escaped would be unwise from them. It was confusing and difficult to navigate for everyone involved. The Jedi didn't want to be trusting of just anyone, and Sola Grey, while being far removed from Tarkin, was still a former Sith. Her past remained a mystery, but as Oppo was grappling with his own morality about helping a former Sith, Sola was learning someone else's past. Thanks to Anakin leaving R2 behind, she was able to speak with him like a friend. She wasn't really welcomed amongst the Jedi ranks. The younglings and Padawans weren't disrespectful to her, but they recognized that the older Jedi on Ahch-To didn't treat her with high praises, so they more or less ignored what she said half the time. She was isolated as a result. Oppo would work on changing that, but until that change could be seen, she asked R2 for his story, how he managed to find himself back with the Republic. His story was perhaps more traumatic than anyone realized. He was on Coruscant when the Sith Empire struck. The Senate District was detonated, and he happened to be with Padme and C-3PO. He recalled the attack, and how the people died without a chance to ask for surrender. Droids aren't meant to feel things, but guilt would be equatable to what R2 experienced. Little Astromech survived by a fingernail of luck. Padme's office collapsed on her and 3PO, killing them both instantly. R2 was trapped under the rubble, left with enough room to squirm, until remaining trapped for what he didn't realize was months. R2 remained in low power mode until the debris of the Senate building was removed. The Sith were using it for their superstructure, so he escaped the wreckage. All R2 remembered seeing of 3PO was his hand sticking out of the rubble, not golden, just rusted and covered in soot. R2 had to use a Sith vessel to escape the planet, but his reunion with Anakin didn't come so quickly. He bounced around from system to system until accidentally being intercepted by a Republic fleet, a would-be Skywalkers. The process was arduous, unexciting, and left R2 with an emptiness he had never experienced before. That was something the Astromech explained to Sola, because he struggled to accept that he failed to protect Senator Amidala. They were both harmed by the Sith in completely different ways. This mutual pain The trauma they both experienced became a binding between them. R2 didn't have much time to reunite with Anakin because of the attack on Coruscant, and Tarkin's betrayal, of course. They had their reunion, but it was short-lived because battles came, war changed, and Skywalker was lost at Dathomir. R2 needed a friend until Anakin returned, and Sola had been missing one since leaving the Sith, perhaps since she had ever been one of them. Her story would be told to the astromech, one that would further cement their relationship. As they continued sharing stories, they watched from the weeping willow at the center of the Jedi camp as Oppo gathered the younglings together so that he could teach them his next lessons. And that, my friends, is episode 35. Got some crazy cool build up here. Got the Separatists, the Republic. Where's the treaty gonna go? I don't know. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.